This is episode 29 of That Shakespeare Life.
Hi, I'm Philippa Brahe, writer and lead historian at British History Tours. Another great method for studying history of Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
When Shakespeare does talk about, the stars and the spheres, this is a term that goes back to the ancient Greeks, the heavenly spheres to which the planets were thought to be attached, or he talks about, eclipses or comets and so on, the ideas of Ptolemy and Aristotle, ideas that go back to ancient Greeks and that were still prevalent and in fact were still being taught. And I don't think Shakespeare is necessarily trying to convince anyone to think of the universe in a particular way, but he's really good at taking things that were in the air, debates that were happening, and then extracting some entertainment value out of them.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
William Shakespeare's life overlapped some of the most extraordinary scientific discoveries in human history. Modern thought was developing the idea of a round Earth, the sun being the center of the universe, and scientific minds like Galileo, Thomas Digges, and Tycho Brahe were utilizing cutting-edge technology like the telescope to transform the way we thought about the universe and the human's place in that universe. This swirl of scientific thought, imagination, and theory was buzzing around William Shakespeare right at the same time he was penning some of the plays so famous for asking many of these same human questions scientists were seeking to answer about the universe. And in the case of Thomas Digges, these questions were being raised literally right down the street from where William Shakespeare lived. Here to help us unpack some of the realities about scientific thought in the 16th century and what an understanding of that culture can help us learn about William Shakespeare is the man who literally wrote the book on the science of Shakespeare, our very special guest, Dan Falk. Dan is an award-winning freelance writer and broadcaster specializing in science stories. He was the 2011-2012 Knight Science Journalism Fellow at MIT. He has written numerous publications for Smithsonian, New Scientist, Scientific American, The Globe, and Mail, The Walrus, Astronomy, Sky and Telescope, Quanta, Nautilus, NBC News, Mental Floss, and many other newspaper, magazines, and websites. In addition to being an accomplished science writer, though, Dan is also a successful science radio broadcaster, having written and produced dozens of radio documentaries, primarily for the CBC radio program called Ideas. Several of these documentaries have won prestigious international awards, and he is the co-host of a podcast called Book Lab with science journalist Amanda Gefter. The podcast reviews the latest and popular science books. Dan joins us today to discuss his most recent book called The Science of Shakespeare, which was published in April of 2014. His book explores the time period of Shakespeare's life and specifically the massive upheaval of scientific thought that was happening in the very same neighborhood where Shakespeare lived and worked. We're delighted to have Dan here with us today to take us behind the curtain and into the science life of William Shakespeare. Hello, Dan. Welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks very much, Cassidy. I'm very happy to be here.
Did the field of science as we know it today exist in Shakespeare's lifetime?
Well, that's a good question about science and what science was like in Shakespeare's time. I guess the way we think of modern science today, especially, divided up into disciplines like astronomy and physics and medicine and geology and chemistry, that kind of clearly defined set of fields of inquiry, that didn't exist in Shakespeare's time. But not only that, the sort of the scientific method as we think of it today that we sort of teach to high school kids or to first year undergrads, that didn't really exist either. So science was just, I would say, beginning to be a thing. In Shakespeare's time, a lot of people believed in magic and witchcraft and astrology. And of course, it's not that those things have completely disappeared. It varies from one part of the world to another today. And for sure, some people here in North America still read their horoscopes hopefully for entertainment purposes or whatever. But to a large extent, those things have started to play a much less central role in our lives, and science has come to play a much bigger role in our lives. But I think when Shakespeare was living, it was kind of a transition period, and it was really just the beginning of that. And I'll say just a few extra things about that. A few key players were around at this time. Copernicus had actually already died. So Copernicus, of course, had come up with this kind of bold idea that, the planets go around the sun, not the Earth, that the Earth might not be the center of everything. And he died in 1543, so 20 years and a bit before Shakespeare was born. And Vesalius had published a book about human anatomy with some very modern ideas in it. That was actually published in the same year that Copernicus published his book, and also the same year that Copernicus died, so that was also 1543. And people like Galileo was a contemporary of Shakespeare. They were born in the same year. And the age of exploration was underway too. So new lands and new continents and new peoples were being discovered, and new kinds of interaction. So all these things were happening just as I think the world was, as I say, kind of in transition. So some of these older ideas of magic and different kinds of superstition were just beginning to be superseded by more modern ways of thinking. That's how I would put it.
Well, what did Shakespeare believe about the center of the universe? Did he believe the sun went around the Earth? Did he agree with Copernicus?
So this is a big question. How much, if anything, did Shakespeare know about what Copernicus had written about the planets going around the sun? And I think scholars have, to some extent, either kind of sidestepped this question or sort of thought about it briefly and said, well, Shakespeare couldn't have known very much about it, and then sort of moved on. And there's a couple of reasons, I think, why scholars have often taken that position. One of them is that when Shakespeare does talk about, the stars and the spheres, this is a term that goes back to the ancient Greeks, the heavenly spheres to which the planets were thought to be attached, or he talks about, eclipses or comets and so on. It's often sort of ambiguous. There's really hardly anything you can point to in Shakespeare's dramatic writing that says, aha, here we have someone who knew about Copernicus and was on board with it. You don't have sort of clear statements like that commit him to a particular worldview. Instead, you have a lot of statements, and I could give specific examples, but you have a lot of statements that kind of fit either way. They can be interpreted as being an endorsement of maybe the new Copernican view, or they can be interpreted as being just, same old, same old. This is the ideas of Ptolemy and Aristotle, ideas that go back to the ancient Greeks and that were still prevalent, and in fact were still being taught in the early part of the Renaissance when Shakespeare lived. So that's one reason, I think, why scholars haven't probed that in too much detail. And there's a second reason, which is that I think a lot of scholars, well, first of all, there is a possibility that some scholars of, Shakespeare scholars and scholars of literature from this time might not be all that well versed in the history of science. So that's a possibility. And so they might think that, how could he have heard about the Copernican theory? Because nobody took the Copernican theory very seriously. And there's a second reason, I think, why scholars might not have imagined that there was too much to be said about connections between Shakespeare and science, especially Copernicanism. And that's because I think it's felt that Copernicus's ideas weren't taken very seriously until Galileo wrote his little book, Sidereus Nuncius, the Starry Messenger. So this was after Galileo had started to use a telescope and make observations of the heavens. And he published his little book in the spring of 1610. But of course, this is quite late in Shakespeare's career, right? He just had a few more plays to write before he retired and moved back to Stratford. So that's another reason that I think people have sort of given this question kind of short shrift.
Concepts like the Earth going around the sun or the existence of the atom are scientific concepts rarely questioned today, but they weren't well established. As you just mentioned, they were being questioned in Shakespeare's lifetime. So when we find references to Galileo's telescopic discoveries in Cymbeline, or when Shakespeare uses phrases like doubt that the sun doth move in Hamlet, or quote, the heavens themselves, the planets, and the center observe degree, priority, and place from Troilus and Cressida, are these references being used by Shakespeare Shakespeare to show off his intelligence and education? Or is this a comment as a kind of joke, considering that cultural reality that his audience was questioning ideas like the Earth rotating around the sun, considering them to be what one author called great leaps of imagination?
Yeah, so there's this question of how much did Shakespeare's audience know? And that's a difficult one because, of course, he was writing for everyone. So there were people in the audience who did not have any sort of formal education of any kind, right? They were just the sons and daughters of mill workers and clothing makers and so on. And he wanted to make sure that the jokes weren't too far over their heads. But then there were also people who had been educated. There would have been people of noble birth. And of course, sometimes he performed at court. So sometimes he performed for Queen Elizabeth and later for King James. So he had a wide variety of patrons coming into the Globe Theatre and the other theaters where he performed. Certain things I think he just had to assume that people would get. I mean, so, we would say something like, oh, the stars would jump from their spheres. I haven't got the phrase exactly right, but I think, or start from their spheres, something like that. I think it's, I forget which play that's in. I think it occurs more than once. So I think, his audience understood that there was this system of celestial spheres, right? Now, the average person on the street in 1598 London might not have been able to tell you very much about what these celestial spheres were. And I think it's a bit like that today, right? I mean, if you sort of listen to the news a little bit, then you probably know that there's something called the Higgs boson. But how many of us could really answer a short quiz on the Higgs boson, right? Probably most of us wouldn't do very well. People had different, levels of being able to grasp these things. And I think, debates about how the solar system is put together, yeah, it would be like that. I mean, and again, I don't think Shakespeare is necessarily trying to convince anyone to think of the universe in a particular way, but he's really good at taking things that were in the air, debates that were happening, and then extracting some entertainment value out of them. And I'll give just one example of that. So there's a passage in Julius Caesar. It's shortly before Caesar is assassinated, and the citizens of Rome, or a small group of them, are pleading with Caesar to lift an order of banishment that was placed on the brother of one of these guys. And he listens to them, but he brushes them off and he says, well, I could be moved as if I were as you. If prayers could move, then prayers would move me, but I am as fixed as the northern star, or fixed, if you want to pronounce it with two syllables. So he's saying he's like the northern star and can't be budged. Now, let me just briefly say two things about that. So he has to assume that his audience, has some understanding of very basic astronomy, right? So even people who can't really find much more than the Big Dipper in the sky, a lot of people still do understand, or certainly I think in Shakespeare's time when there was no light, there were still clouds, but if it was a cloud-free day, you would absolutely see the stars and the Milky Way even from the outskirts of London. And people would have understood this reference to the northern star, the pole star. This wasn't meant to baffle his audience. They would have understood that the stars kind of move in a circle, but the pole star stays put. So there's that. He must have expected the audience to have this basic level of understanding. The second thing is that, like so many other passages in Shakespeare, it doesn't commit Shakespeare to the Copernican view or to the old Greek view, because you can sort of imagine that whether the Earth is going around the sun or everything is going around the Earth, either way, as the Earth spins, you've got the other stuff sort of seeming to move in the opposite direction in a big circle, with the exception of the northern star. So it's a wonderful metaphor. I wish I could write plays like that, but it works really well, but it's sort of ambiguous. And so many times in Shakespeare, you find a passage like that, and it's sort of ambiguous in terms of what did Shakespeare believe. So that's kind of cool. But, as I was writing the book, I thought, all right, well, so there's more reasons to look into this. So it's kind of interesting, I think.
Shakespeare very often alludes to the concept of the universe, orbit, and the sun in his plays. It's so saturated in his work, this concept of stars and astronomy. He was obviously very educated in this area, but where did a playwright get this kind of education?
Yeah, so there's this question of where did Shakespeare get his knowledge from? And of course, we don't have a precise answer to that, but I can say a few words about it. I mean, he did, as best we know, he went to the grammar school in Stratford. Now, we don't have actual documentation of that, but his father, John, was a sort of fairly important town official. So not quite like a mayor, but almost. So he had a fairly important civic position in the town. And it's pretty clear that, if he wanted to enroll his son in the school, he could. And so we imagine that he probably did. And a grammar school back then, I guess it doesn't sound like much when you compare it with someone like Johnson or Marlowe, who was university educated, but an Elizabethan grammar school was pretty good. And he would have been exposed to the classics, and he would have learned, a bit of Greek and Latin. He certainly would have learned enough that when visiting theatrical groups were in town and doing one of the ancient Greek plays, he would have easily been able to follow along. And then, of course, later in life, especially after he moved to London, he had friends from different parts of the world. He was friends with John Florio, who had been to Italy and knew all there was to know about Italy, which really paid off when Shakespeare had to write plays that were set in Italy. And I think there are different kinds of examples of that. And of course, reading. Publishing was by now, was just beginning to be this big industry, and Shakespeare could afford to buy books at the bookstalls behind St. Paul's Cathedral. So again, we don't have a lot of records of what Shakespeare actually did every day. That's unfortunate. We don't have a lot of those details from his life, but there's nothing to have stopped him from buying books and reading books. By the time he moved to London, I think he was already pretty well exposed to, the Bible, certainly different editions of it, some of the classics from ancient Greek and Rome, some of the classic poetry. And then he could read different kinds of things. He could have read Montaigne's essays. Of course, they were eventually published, but their scholars believe he was already had a chance to read them in manuscript. This would have been John Florio's English translation of Montaigne's essays, which were published in French. And Montaigne talks about the native peoples of Brazil and all kinds of things, which Shakespeare would have used as one of his sources later when he was writing The Tempest. So he had a lot of ways of learning things, and this would apply also to learning about what we now call science. And I won't go into too much detail, but in my book, The Science of Shakespeare, I talk about connections he may have had to the family of Thomas Digges, and Digges had written an almanac in English, sort of promoting the Copernican theory, and with a new diagram of the universe in it that kind of even suggests that maybe the universe is infinite in size. So Shakespeare had a lot of routes by which he could have come into this knowledge.
I want to ask about infinite space. And Hamlet, the prince, describes himself as saying, "Oh God, I could be bounded in a nutshell and count myself a king of infinite space." That comes in Act 2 of Hamlet, and it begs the question of whether or not the average 17th century playgoer would understand the concept of infinite space.
Yeah, so there's this very strange, or at least interesting, passage in Hamlet where he says, "I could be bounded in a nutshell and still consider myself king of infinite space." And it's an unusual line. It doesn't the references to infinity don't occur very often in Shakespeare, and certainly not references to infinite space. And they don't occur very much in early Renaissance writing in general. So it's kind of an odd phrase. And again, I think there's at least a plausible case to be made here that it relates to what he had read about the structure of the heavens coming from Thomas Digges. And I can say just a little bit more about who Digges is and why he's important. So Thomas Digges was perhaps the most significant English scientific figure of Shakespeare's time. There are a few others. There's Thomas Dee, there's Thomas Harriot. There's a couple of people of interest. I don't know why they're all named Thomas. That's just a coincidence, I guess. But Digges was the son of someone named Leonard Digges, who was also sort of a very early astronomer and mathematician. And Thomas Digges sort of followed in his footsteps. The father had published an almanac. Almanacs were very popular in those days. An almanac would have had things like weather predictions, which probably weren't very good, but whatever, and astronomical data, which actually would have been pretty good. So predictions of eclipses and that sort of thing, and probably advice about when to plant crops and get married and all that sort of thing. And Thomas Digges published an updated version of his father's almanac, and as I think I just mentioned very briefly, he expanded it to include, sort of a chapter that was like a summary of Copernicus's theory and kind of an endorsement of it. I mean, he's sort of clearly talking about Copernicus because he thinks it's probably correct. So he puts that in there. And then he includes something that Copernicus didn't even have in his book, which was a diagram suggesting that the universe might be infinite. So there's a famous diagram in Copernicus's book that shows a series of concentric circles with the sun at the middle, and the Earth is, the third rock from the sun. So this is an idea that we credit to Copernicus. Well, and there were a couple of Greek thinkers that thought that this was plausible, but the idea didn't really catch on in ancient times. So we usually give credit to Copernicus. But then Copernicus had the stars, the so-called fixed stars, the stars that make up the constellations, all existing at the same distance from the sun. So you can think of them as being attached to the inside of a crystalline sphere. So that was how Copernicus envisioned it. Whether or not he thought the spheres actually existed, sort of beside the point, but he thought the stars were all at a certain distance away from the sun. But in Diggs's diagram, it's completely different. In Thomas Diggs's diagram, the stars are just kind of scattered about beyond the orbit of the most distant planet, which at that time was Saturn. Saturn would have been the most distant planet known. And beyond that were the stars at varying distances, right up to the edge of the page. In other words, as if to suggest that they keep going after the page ends, and that the universe might even be infinite. And then we can ask ourselves, well, did Shakespeare have any chance to encounter this idea? And this is something I talk about in some detail in the book. Diggs lived in London. Now, Thomas Diggs died somewhat early, so they didn't overlap in London very much. But Diggs's widow and his two sons continued to live there, and for a while they were actually neighbors. That is to say, they lived within a few blocks of Shakespeare in the neighborhood called Cripplegate, just north of St. Paul's Cathedral. We actually know where Shakespeare lived. This is a little bit complicated, but we know where Shakespeare lived because he rented a room from a French hat maker named Mountjoy, and because of legal documents involving a certain legal dispute, we actually know where he lived. Most of Shakespeare's other homes, we don't know where they're located exactly. So that's a route by which Shakespeare could have gotten to know the Diggs family. Diggs would have been in correspondence with the Danish astronomer Tycho Brahe and other thinkers. So there are a few different ways to imagine that Shakespeare was encountering scientific ideas through Diggs. And again, this diagram, he could have seen it with his own eyes. I think it's possible. So there you go. This was a novel idea. In England at this time, as I argue in the book, there would have been a small handful of people, not much more than a handful, who were really interested in the Copernican theory and thought it was worth writing about or talking about. And Diggs just happens to be the one who took it the furthest and kind of said, well, you know what? Maybe the universe is bigger than anyone thought. Maybe the universe is infinite. As I say, it's sort of plausible that Shakespeare was exposed to this idea.
Did Shakespeare know Tycho Brahe?
So the connections to Tycho Brahe are really interesting. And just briefly, I'll say who Tycho Brahe was. Tycho Brahe was he died in the very early 1600s. So he was a 16th century and very early 17th century Danish astronomer of noble birth. He actually ended up being quite wealthy, or I guess he was born into wealth for that matter. He made very important observations before the invention of the telescope. He was the greatest of the pre-telescopic astronomers. And the most important thing that he observed was what we now call a supernova. Well, of course, he didn't know it was a supernova. It was a new star that appeared in the sky in the fall of 1572. Shakespeare was just a young lad at that time. But a new star appears in the sky. It was kind of shocking because in the ancient Greek way of seeing things, the sky is supposed to be kind of fixed. Like the stars just aren't supposed to change. But a new star appeared. We now understand that it was a supernova explosion, and that's the physics of what was going on. Tycho Brahe ended up publishing a little book about it, and the King of Denmark was very impressed and gave Tycho Brahe his own island in the channel between Denmark and Sweden to an observatory and to pursue his observations. Now, Tycho is an interesting figure because he was not exactly completely on board with the Copernican theory, but he wasn't on board with the ancient Greek theory either. So he developed his own sort of hybrid theory in which the planets move around the sun, but then the sun moves around the earth. So this is sometimes called the Tychonic system, or sort of a heliogeocentric or geoheliocentric, something like that. It's this complicated hybrid system of the universe. But now, what did Shakespeare know of Tycho Brahe's work? Well, as I say, Tycho Brahe corresponded with English astronomers including digs. So that was one route to that knowledge. But there's more than that. So we don't think that we have no evidence that Shakespeare ever left England, but his friends sure did. Members of his acting company performed at the court in Elsinore, or Helsingor as it's called in Danish, but we think of it by its English name, Elsinore, which Shakespeare later adopts as the name for the castle where the setting of Hamlet unfolds. And this is very close to where Tycho Brahe had his observatory. So from the castle at Elsinore, you can see the island of Vian, and it's just a couple of miles off the shore. Now, again, this doesn't prove that his acting friends who performed there met Tycho. They probably didn't, but they could have easily heard about it. And Tycho was kind of a celebrity too. Like, he was a very important figure in Denmark at the time. So it's very possible they at least heard about him. And, he was so big a celebrity that even King James visited the island. Now, the King James of Scotland, later King James of England, but this was actually but before he had become King of England. But nonetheless, it just shows that he was Tycho Brahe was a much sought-after figure. If it had been the 21st century, James would have, posed for a selfie with Tycho or something. Instead, they probably just, talked about things. But so Shakespeare could have various different routes of encountering Tycho Brahe. And then if you want, I'll leave it at that for now. But there is something interesting to be said about the names Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. So if you like, I can say a few words about that.
Yes, I definitely want to hear about that. What is it about Rosencrantz and Guildenstern?
So when you look at the cast of characters in Hamlet, you notice something interesting. First of all, it's a very long play. It's the longest play that Shakespeare wrote. It actually has a very long cast of characters, too. And a lot of the characters have sort of typical, sort of classical sounding names. If you were just making up names that sounded like they had been around for quite a few centuries, you would make up names like Ophelia and Claudius and Laertes and Polonius. But two names that stand out are Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. These actually do sound like Danish names. And as I say, Shakespeare had never been to Denmark. So where did he come up with these names, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern? And this is where I think things get really interesting, because I've mentioned that Tycho Brahe was this Danish astronomer on his island discovering things. Tycho Brahe also had a printing press on his island. So he was publishing his observations and sending them to colleagues around Europe. But he did something else. At the start of these publications, he would put an engraving of himself. As best I can tell, Tycho was quite full of himself. He was kind of a pompous fellow. You can even sense from the portrait. If you look up the portrait of Tycho Brahe, you even get a bit of a sense of that. So there's this quite well-known copperplate engraving, and there are different versions of it, but they're all somewhat similar. They show him wearing his full regalia. He's a nobleman, and he's really dressed to the nines in this portrait. And then surrounding his actual portrait is a set of coats of arms. So these are little shields with names on them, the coats of arms of all of his illustrious relatives. Now, the reason he's doing that is he's trying to say, look, it's not just that I'm a big deal. All my cousins are big deals too, right? They're all really important people. Oh, yeah. So he's including their coats of arms around the circumference of this portrait. And that's fine. And so under each little shield and little design and picture, there's a name, right? Because there's a name for each of his relatives, and one of them is named Rosencrantz, and one of them is named Guildenstern.
Oh,
and that's kind of amazing. At least I thought it's kind of amazing. And when I first came across, so first of all, let me just say I'm not the one who discovered this. Other people have noticed this, but I was certainly shocked when I saw it. I dug into the history a little bit, and sure enough, somebody noticed this and wrote about it in the 1930s, and then I don't know, I guess it was sort of like forgotten or whatever. And then somebody wrote about it again in the 1960s and so on. And here I am writing about, well, I guess my book came out in 2014. So I wrote about it in 2014. If people remember, that's great. If they forget, that's okay too. Someone will rediscover this connection.
It's fun to look at it again. Yeah.
20 or 30 years, that's fine. But, so, and then the question is, well, what does this prove? Does this prove anything? Does it prove that Shakespeare got the idea of the names because he saw this diagram, this engraving of Tycho and his relatives? And I think the answer to that is, yeah, it's a very plausible thing. And it's not proof, because there are other ways in which he could have come across those names, but they are very Danish-sounding names. And he gives those two characters a fairly significant role to play in Hamlet, right? Hamlet without Rosencrantz and Guildenstern becomes a very different play. And as I say, Tycho corresponded with Thomas Digges, and Thomas Digges was a neighbor of Shakespeare, living just a couple of doors up the way in Cripplegate. So it is possible, I think, and a very small number of scholars have thought this was an interesting enough point to write papers about. But it is possible that Shakespeare saw the engraving with his own eyes, saw these two names and the other 8 or 10 names too. He wasn't too interested in the other 8 or 10 names. He focused in on the names Rosencrantz and Guildenstern and lifted them. Well, Shakespeare loves to lift things and borrow things. So he borrowed those names for his play. At least I think that is a possibility of how he did that.
That is very interesting, fascinating. We'll include a link to this portrait in today's show notes to show people exactly what you're talking about, and even link over to your book so they can know more about that. But I wanted to ask you, obviously there is more about this topic that we can learn and explore than what we'll cover in today's episode. So I wonder if you could share with us some of your favorite resources, and that can be books or websites that you recommend to learn more about this topic.
Okay. Yeah, it's almost hard to know where to begin in recommending books and websites. I think I'll actually just stick to books because I have a bit more to say. There's so many Shakespeare websites, and perhaps I'm not in a position to pick favorites, but books I definitely can. As I was researching and then writing The Science of Shakespeare, there were a few that I really kept dipping back into a lot. Certainly one that your listeners will know, of course, is Will in the World by Stephen Greenblatt. So that's quite well known and was somewhat of a bestseller. I think that's quite a good one. A good one, I think, for people who are maybe just starting out, because it's actually quite short, but it's still quite thorough, is The Age of Shakespeare by Frank Kermode. Now, it's a few years old. It's older than Greenblatt's book, but I think it still holds up very, very well. And for people who really like to get into the original source documents, and this is an older book too, but because it was so thoroughly done, it's still kind of the go-to book in terms of original sources and documentation. It's Schoenbaum's book, William Shakespeare, A Compact Documentary Life. So that's another one that I recommend. And then since I was just sort of pulling everything off the shelf, I guess I really did enjoy James Shapiro's book, 1599, A Year in the Life of William Shakespeare. Now, there's a newer book, but I haven't read it yet. I think he has a book, what's it called? The Year of Lear, if I've got that right. So, but I haven't read that yet, so I can't give a thumbs up on that.
It's good, yeah.
Yet. And I enjoyed Peter Ackroyd's book, Shakespeare, the biography. There's so many others. I think Bill Bryson has a short one too, and it's pretty good, very readable and quite short. Those are a small handful that I recommend. But when I was, when I was researching my book, I would go down to that section of the library at the University of Toronto, and the books just go on forever. I mean, if you don't eventually take a break for lunch or to go home, you'll just be there forever.
You'll read forever.
There's no end of books. But those I thought were sort of good enough that I'm very proud to keep them in my home collection, and will dip back into them from time to time.
Excellent. Well, we ask everyone here this next question at That Shakespeare Life, and that is, what is the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? Now, you are allowed the complete works of Shakespeare and the Bible, because my friends in England tell me I have to give you those two, but this will be your 1 to 2 titles you would choose in addition to those.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I wish I had I bet your other guests have really good prepared answers to that question. I'm not sure I have a great prepared answer. I'm not sure I would even bother taking a Bible. I don't want to offend anyone, but I'm just not sure what I would do with the Bible on a deserted island. Complete works of Shakespeare, I guess, could be fun to dip into. Now, beyond that, maybe I would take something that I've never read, because if I'm going to be on this island for a while, it'd be a chance to really do some leisure reading. So maybe I would take Ulysses and finally read the darn thing and see if it's this life-changing experience that it's supposed to be. I have read some of Joyce's shorter works, but here I am confessing to your audience that I haven't read Ulysses. And then, not to, I don't want to sound facetious, but I think I would take like a astronomy almanac, or a book that tells you, everything you need to know about where the stars and planets are going to be, and the tides and the trade winds and stuff like that to help me get off the island. So I might go, although I wouldn't, I guess the slightly snarky answer is I would take like a monthly subscription to Sky and Telescope or astronomy, but I don't know how they would get me my monthly
They would airlift it or something.
Or something like that. So yeah, it's a really good question, but I guess I do
Those are
struggle
good.
with that one.
Those are
especially
good.
if you're going to be on the island for a long time, because even if you take your favorite book, you're eventually going to get tired of it if you're reading it over and over again.
True. Very scientific choices there, Dan Falk. Thank you very much. Well, what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
Well, I do have an idea for what might eventually be my next book, and I don't want to say too much about it because it's really just in the very formative stages. So, feel free to check in with me again in a few years. But I am quite interested in Charles Darwin. Well, of course, a lot has been written about Darwin, but like how Shakespeare and Galileo lived in this period of transition, I think Darwin did as well, in that I think Darwin really did usher in today's world, this world where many of us tend to think that things happened due to natural causes and natural processes that can ultimately be explained in terms of physics. And Darwin was the one who showed how this applied to the world of living things. I don't want to write just another Darwin biography because there's a million of them out there already, but I think the interactions that he had with other thinkers at the time is something that I might want to explore a little bit, and just to sort of to focus in on how the world changed, how the way we think about the world changed in Darwin's time. So, but I just want to say that's a possibility. So we'll see how that goes. In the meantime, I'm going to Australia for about a month because I'm doing a journalist in residence position at the University of New South Wales, and it begins in just over a week. So I have to pack my bags, and it's not quite choosing one book for a desert island, but I have to choose a couple of books to read on the flight to Australia. So yeah, I have to pack. I guess I have to think about that. But anyway, then that will last about a month, and then we'll take it from there.
Okay. Well, Dan Falk, producer and author of The Science of Shakespeare, we appreciate you sharing this expertise with us and giving us places to explore this topic more. I know I am fascinated by some of the things you've shared with us today, and I appreciate your time.
Yeah, thanks so much, Cassidy. It's really been my pleasure to do this. So yeah, thanks very much for having me.
The Copernican view of the universe that Dan Falk mentions in today's episode is available as part of an ebook download that goes along with today's episode. You can download that diagram as well as some of the astronomical quotes from Shakespeare's plays that relate to some of these theories Shakespeare would have been reading when he was writing his plays, as well as learn more about Dan Falk, his book, The Science of Shakespeare, and some of the resources he mentioned, all packed into today's show notes. The show notes contain a lot more history than we're able to fit into the episode today, so I encourage you to go and check that out to learn more about today's topic. You can find that and more at CassidyCash.com/episode 29. That's CassidyCash.com/EP29. Would you like to meet me in England? In September 2019, I'm taking a group over with British History Tours to walk through the life of William Shakespeare. We'll be spending a couple of days in Stratford-upon-Avon, and then we'll travel over to London to see the Globe, where we'll have a private behind-the-scenes tour there, and we're hoping to get to see a play. And I want you to go with us. It would be amazing to get to meet you at all, but certainly to get to meet you in William Shakespeare's hometown would be amazing. Please consider traveling with us and get your early bird tickets while they last. There's still a few of them left, but we are only giving early bird tickets to the first 8 people who sign up. But you can still grab some of those and get all of the details about the trip at CassidyCash.com/travel Shakespeare. That's it for this week here at That Shakespeare Life. Until next time, I'm Cassidy Cash, that Shakespeare girl, and I hope your week is a Shakespeare-filled week.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.